about bond requirements. Some of these projects can get really big and probably be pretty expensive. How do we choose that bond requirement?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last part? How do we use that bond requirement?
Yeah, how is the 10,000 bond required selected, and is that enough to repair a project? Should the contractor do something in excess of what a permit would allow?
Sure. So that 10,000 has been in place for a little while. Don't know the exact when that was first implemented, but it's been for a while here. We haven't needed to use that recently. We do have as a condition on some of the major applications for conditional use permits where it would probably be more of a factor. We do have financial guarantees that have been attached as a condition on the permit, so that if it would go above and beyond, say the 10,000 or something, we could list that as a financial guarantee to be, to be supplied, so that if we wouldn't run into that problem. But on most minor projects, it doesn't, it doesn't really pose to be, it wouldn't pose an issue to be more than 10,000. I would say the majority of the projects.
Nick, Jeff Bertram, the last meeting, I'm still reading the minutes and still reflecting back on the last meeting. Maybe I'm not clear, but we're kind of talking through this as elements of what we've talked through the whole comprehensive plan. And now ultimately, if we have an interest in making some changes to the ordinances, ultimately, who's wagging the dog here? I mean, should we really be leading that? Or, in my opinion, if the commissioners don't have a flavor for certain things, shouldn't we kind of be zeroing in on what they do have an interest in changing potentially, rather than just us throwing out a bunch of things that we think maybe could be changed or should be changed? If there's no interest in doing it, aren't we kind of spinning the wheels here a little bit?
Well, a lot of these options that are put forward here are a combination of various factors and input. One of them being throughout the comprehensive plan process, thinking about things like flexibility, thinking about things that are outlined in the goals and policies that we established as part of the comprehensive plan. We tried to make these, align to those kinds of concerns that we've had. And then in addition, we kind of used some of the feedback from last time to try to address some of the concerns that have come up as well. And then I think the third thing here is also observations that, we've had as staff, that things that we notice, things that might be out of place or common things that come up that, if those are addressed, it can, improve and kind of get us to where we want to be as part of the comprehensive plan. So it's kind of a combination of various things there that, that ultimately, if the commissioners feel that those are appropriate and things that are worthwhile to look at amending, then we would proceed. But I think we've drawn on some of this evidence and things in the past as part of these options.
Because some of the things that we've experienced now in the last 6 months that I've never seen before, and I don't know that we've seen before, the facts are that there's fewer landscapers that are licensed today than there ever were. So contractors stopped licensing, which obviously we don't know why that is, but there's less contractors licensed today, but we all know they're still out there doing work to some degree. We've never seen a contractor, well, I shouldn't say I've never seen a contractor directly violate the ordinance in several different ways on several different projects and continue to be able to operate. And then the third thing that we haven't seen, or I haven't seen for a long time, is just dramatic violations, clear cutting on 2 instances And so this first happened kind of when the ordinance went into effect, where people were still testing how serious the county was going to take their ordinance and if they were going to actually enforce it or not. But these kinds of blatant violations haven't happened for years, to my knowledge. And so it's suddenly happening. The good news is it's not happening to 5 contractors or 10 contractors. It's happening to 1, 2. And then the good news is that there aren't 50 people out there doing it, just blatant clear cutting or whatever. There's a handful, but it's increasing. And so how do we nip that? In my opinion, the only way we nip that is if we truly want to enforce the ordinance, is we have to take immediate and direct action to stop that behavior. Otherwise, word will get out and it will continue to occur even more than what we've seen in the last six months.
Yeah, I agree that, we should take action if there's something, if there's things we want to make sure that we implement so that we can take action on violations and things, we should make sure that we have the right language in the ordinance to allow us to do that. I would agree. I just did want to make one point, though, in terms of the number of licensed contractors. You had mentioned there are fewer today than ever before. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. At the last meeting we did talk about the number that have been licensed at one point over a number of years. And that number is obviously larger than the number that are licensed currently.
One thing that's frustrating to me is people do after the fact, they pay the extra $500 and it's like that's just a way of doing business. Same thing would be as if we slap a $1,000 fine on a violation. For some of these folks that are doing, $50,000 to $100,000 project, $1,000 fine is nothing. And it means nothing, because if they want to do something, and we've seen that incident where we had all that rock blown out on that lot, in 50 loads of rock taken off of a parcel, and then being able to make it buildable. I mean, that's just the price of doing business. And we just don't want those things, happening. And I guess my point would be, how do we keep that, from happening, at least to have some teeth in it, that contractors must know that before they cut a tree, before they put a shovel in the ground, there's got to be a permit if they're near the water. And the idea that, I thought the property owner had it. The property owner says, I thought the contractor had it. That just can't happen. And somehow we've got to let those contractors know that if they're going to disturb the shoreland, there has to be a permit, and the onus is on them, perhaps, and not the property owner. And it can't be $1,000 fine because again, like I say, if you're doing a $50,000 project, the violation means nothing.
But it's, in a way, Joe, it could be. Are the license renewed every year?
Yeah, so they are renewed every year.
So
I just wanted to add here too that every contractor that has done work without a license has come in front of the county board. And that is the standard process. So, the board can't use the discretion to determine if other action needs to be taken other than a fine or an after the fact fee. That can be done, and it is done. It is the standard practice.
Yeah, because I would think too, if you have it could even read, if you have so many violations in, let's say, a certain period of time, you won't get your contractor's license renewed.
Some of the examples that have been cited, and I agree, they've been issues. How many of those were actually directed by the contractor, though, versus being performed by the property owner? And I guess from what I've seen, it's been a little bit more the property owner that's been doing those things. And while they have a contractor involved on aspects of the project, how do you, if a contractor is hired and performs a portion of their work as they should, it gets really tricky trying to regulate that as far as who did what actions and then who's responsible for it. I think if a contractor knowingly violates the ordinances, that's one thing, and there should be the processes to hold them accountable for that. It gets tricky when it's a property owner that does that. And how are there, I guess, penalties that violate that when done blatantly? I think what Joe cited earlier with some of the stone and stuff from one of the properties, I mean, those blatant ones can be, should be addressed differently with the property owner, in my opinion.
That was actually a question I had. But Nick, maybe you've got something to follow up with what Jeff, Joe, Jason, and Steve, certainly you brought up the license. I was wondering, with some of the examples brought up, would this option be an additional tool that you think potentially could be effective, or how would you see it playing out with contractors? And then separately, Nick, do you have other thoughts about when it's the property owner?
Yeah, so I think Jason really got to the factor that there's kind of two separate issues at play, and I would totally agree. So what we're talking about here on this slide specifically is just kind of filling a gap for improving the licensed shoreline contractors to be more cognizant of the work that they're doing and adhering to the ordinance requirements. And then in terms of property owners blatantly doing work, I think in that realm, after the fact fees in some circumstances might be an answer, but I don't know that they will be the answer because on all of them, because of the fact that the fee would have to be pretty high to be a significant portion of the cost of the project on some of these larger ones. I don't have a definitive answer or any ideas that really haven't been mentioned previously on that aspect, but if there are ideas or things that we want to look into, we can definitely pursue those. But
well, and to that point,
Nick, I like what you've got there, is that if the landowner went ahead and clear cut the trees, the contractor can't move forward with additional work until that issue has been remedied. I guess that's what I see in option one.
So option one's just addressing work that's performed by the contractor. The ordinance already has a provision that if there are outstanding violations, they'll need those on a parcel that needs to be resolved before the additional permits can be issued. So it's kind of a separate piece. So one is based on the parcel, which isn't listed here. It's based on violations on that specific property. This option right here is specifically addressing work that's performed by a licensed contractor, whether it's on the same property or a different one. They would need to mitigate and correct that defective work elsewhere before they could get a permit or work on additional projects.
Yeah. Well, and so one of the comments I was going to make is maybe we already have the vehicle to address that. And as painful as it is to sit on a planning commission and see an after-the-fact major shoreline alteration come through, maybe that's the way that the process is supposed to play out. And now the planning commission, in essence, can make a decision whether or not what they did is just or unjust, and then the cost becomes into restoring it to the original state. I don't know, just a thought there, but to me, they are two separate issues, and maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to look at the current vehicle and let people understand that's going to be the process. And the planning commission may have to say no to a lot more of those after the facts, particularly when we're done. We get the intent of paying a fine and driving on.
So Angie Berg, I'm just going to jump in on that and echo a bit of Jason's comments. And I think after we get through all of the different conversations we're going to have tonight, you're going to find that you do have some options that are going to be presented tonight that will make the rules a little bit more clear and potentially more restrictive. And I think that not one of these things is going to be the solution, right? We've been doing this for 40 years, and there's not one thing that we're going to fix tonight that's going to prevent a clear cut or prevent an after the fact. I think what we want to just try to do is tweak what we have, and also perhaps make the rules a little bit more clear and easier for the Planning Commission and the county commissioners to administer.
Yeah, so I guess with that, are there any other questions that, I guess, regarding this specific option, and if this is something that, you know, is favorable or not favorable?
As previous mentioned, I'm okay with the new proposed section.
Okay. With that, we can move on, and then toward the end, if there's any other thoughts that come up, we can always address them there.
Hi, Nick. I'm sorry, Sean Blackman. I'd like to add that, you know, maybe it's something we need to think about while we're talking about these huge variations in the impact and size of violations and stuff, is maybe we need to classify a different kind of a major or minor violation too, and look at different levels of fines or fees assessed dependent on the size of the violation, of the amount of earth moved or whatever, something that's more tiered, and that way is would be able to be employed to assess depending on case by case basis.
Yeah, definitely. We can definitely talk about that. All right, well, if there's nothing else, we can move on. Next, we can look at rock riprap. So we've got the current ordinance language here. Kind of talked about this last time. Some of the thoughts and discussion from meeting one. To maybe consider shoreline classification and water body size. Talked a little bit about the fact that property owners really like the look of riprap, and that's kind of what they want or they're familiar with. Contractors like to sell it and install it, and often do not use alternatives like bioengineering. And the erosion potential is often self-induced through alterations and poor shoreline practices. So we kind of went through some of these pretty common visuals from areas around the county. Talked about how there might be some situations where riprap is the best option, so we want a little bit of flexibility with that. So here we have a couple different options if we wanted to address riprap in a little bit different way. Option one would place more of the discretion of feasibility of riprap to the department or SWCD. We could use tools like and information like the highest known water level, erosion calculation tools, and other technical data, and utilize that in addition to the site conditions to determine whether rock is really necessary in that application. This would also create incentive to use bioengineered solutions because there would be no permit required to address the erosion problems when rock isn't used. This would be pretty clear to explain to property owners. Would be, you know, more of a kind of, we use technical tools to determine the feasibility kind of thing. Option two would be slightly less restrictive in terms of allowing rock riprap placement. This, you know, rock could still be used regardless of what it is that's causing the erosion problem. This option would still result in significant rock placement around the county, but in an attempt to kind of mitigate the poor practices along the shoreline, this option would incorporate a native buffer requirement along the length of the riprap placement. there are challenges with this approach. It can be difficult and time intensive to manage projects after year one, after we do re-inspections on them. So that would be a potential challenge for this, but some counties have incorporated this with varying degrees of success. So there's kind of two different tiers here. And with that, I guess we can kind of open it up if there's any discussion or thoughts on these options.
I read both of these, went back and forth, and I think I prefer option one. The portion that I guess the aspect I dislike about option one is also the part that makes it probably the best based on the varying nature of shorelines throughout the county, and that it's a little bit more subjective, in what's deemed appropriate by department or the Sauk watershed district. Now, that's kind of vague, right? But the whole point is to start the discussion and to plan something that's appropriate based on the shoreline. So that's, to me, the intent of what the long-range comprehensive plan was saying, is more flexibility based on the property. From a simplification perspective, option two is a little more black and white, but it also, then anytime you're black and white with stuff, we don't live in a black and white world when it comes to shorelines. Every shoreline's unique. So option one is the one I preferred.
Jason, this is Greg Berg with the Stern Soil Water Conservation District, and you kind of hit on a little bit of what I had talked to Nick about, and that was that maybe there could be either administratively or within the ordinance some things that are looked at. And that could be like highest known water level, maybe elevations where you are seeing actual erosion that is presented, or wave action across the lake that's going to get to a certain height to help, determine if there's enough erosion to warrant rock and how much should be placed. Whether or not you put that right in the ordinance, or there may be some guidance for a contractor or a landowner, if they propose a riprap project, that they have to provide that information, and then it's reviewed. It's not like the Soil and Water Conservation District never proposes rock, but it's usually done in the reverse fashion, is try to use more natural or bioengineering techniques first, and then look at rock as a secondary option or in conjunction, with it. And in all the years I've been doing this, I don't know that I've ever seen a contractor come in with a landowner on their own and propose something other than a retaining wall or rock. So we have to kind of swing that a little bit somehow.
Greg, I think you hit kind of the nail on the head as far as education and as far as what people want, because people are going to be looking at what their neighbors have done in the last 10 years. And with all the rock we've got out there, they're going to say, well, why can't I? But again, I don't agree with the rock, because again, it takes away from the ecosystem and the quality of the lake. So I like number one, I guess. So I would see us having to educate landowners as far as what that rock does, and trying to get it away from doing it only for the aesthetic purposes I think they want it for.
Jason Crone with one more comment. Greg, I liked what you said regarding putting some tangible measurements that you guys would review or look at that would be consistent from project to project as a baseline of quantifying. So to take some of the subjectivity out, you kind of list some of the things that you would look at and review. It doesn't have to be extensive, but just a couple of those key things in determining when riprap's appropriate and when it's not. What are those measurements? That might be a nice little thing to add to this, but otherwise, one I think really does a good job.
I'm clueless how to do this, but so many regulations are punitive. If you do this, we're going to do that. Or if you do that, we won't let you do this. I hope we can come up with some ways to structure this so that property owners and contractors have an incentive to some sort to achieve the ends that enhance the water body or the project.
Is there any merit to kind of reviewing neighboring counties too? I mean, you guys put it together with those different counties on there. Are any one of these sized up to what the neighbors are doing?
Yeah, so, and I can even pull it up here on the screen. So yeah, I mean, there were various other counties that were listed in here that had either, so for the higher standards on each of these sections, if they have higher standards, it means that they're more restrictive in some way than what we have in our ordinance currently. And then, so I mean, there are various examples of that where maybe there's like in number 2, the buffer strip behind the riprap is a fairly common one, you know, but there are examples of certain counties that will, you know, specifically state that riprap isn't allowed under certain, you know, just for aesthetics, or that, you know, there needs to be some kind of, you have to kind of rein it in a little bit, and there's certain requirements that need to be met. So some counties would do limit it to a certain percentage of the shoreline. The challenge there is if there's more than that percentage that's experiencing erosion that might need it, then you start to run into those challenges. You know, on areas that rock might be a good option.
Angie Berg jumping in. So I know Nick had sent this out, what's on the screen, to the group. And so was there anything that the group liked? Any individuals liked any aspects of any of the particular counties, or do you prefer looking at the one of the 2 options that Nick presented? It sounded like option 1 was well received by people we did hear from.
Steve here. I kind of like some of like Morrison County's, you know, language. I think, you know, Benton County pretty much, it sounds like, you know, really, you know, they have it in there as aesthetic purposes is prohibited, but maybe our language is general enough to encompass everything, but limiting enough to not just let anything go. Did ours say anything then about establishing a buffer above the rock riprap?
No, so currently there's no buffer requirement. And there's really no consideration of what's causing the erosion either. I mean, if people mow their grass right to the water's edge, there's obviously likely going to be an erosion issue. So we're not really taking into consideration that what's causing the problem necessarily. And we want to try to consider that when we look at this, especially look at the site conditions and let's try to get to the root of the issue here rather than just piling up a bunch of rock. So
sure.
That's spot on. Now, Steve, it's a good question. Is one of the things I looked at the buffer and I thought, you know, is that language we should add to option 1? But that also gets very prescriptive then, and it may not be applicable. The the shoreline I live on is a prime example of what Nick's talking about, where the previous property owners mowed right down to the water's edge. And for 20 years, 30 years, however long they did that, it was erosion, and now you've got a different issue. So what he's speaking to is right, and I think back to the point, every property is unique. Hopefully, pros and cons of option one, but I think the pros outweigh the cons.
Nick, Angie Berg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't option number 2 discuss the buffer, or am I reading that incorrectly?
Yep, option 2 would have that buffer requirement. You know, and the other thing is too is on even if we were to go with more of a number 1, where we're kind of looking at something that we're reviewing and kind of suggesting what should be done, a buffer could be part of that plan. You know, if there's runoff or erosion that's happening because of poor vegetation or something, you know, maybe a buffer can be implemented if the site is you know, favorable for that, or if it calls for that. But you know, that could still be implemented in some way, but it may not be feasible in all situations.
I agree. That makes more sense to add on than to put all these in there and make it too prescriptive or, you know, defined. Because Jason's right. Not there aren't 2 properties the same. So if you can always add more, then I think 1 is fine.
Sounds like we've got 2 people in support of number 1. Any other thoughts or discussion on riprap?
I would support number 1 as well. I think the approval by the Department of the Conservation District, you know, it provides that level of check and professionalism. So these things are designed properly and not just randomly thrown out there saying, hey, I planted some grass, it's good to go. So I like that. It seems to encapsulate much of the discussion of other counties as well. So we're not off from anybody else doing our own strange things.
This is Greg, Nick. I think the only thing we need to do, which I brought up before, is I think we need to have some type of checklist or list of things that would be considered. And, you know, that could be amount of rock, height of rock, you know, what's looked at to determine those things. And then maybe what's brought up now is like a buffer. And, you know, I'm probably not remembering everything, but there probably needs to be something that goes with that so we know what we're reviewing it for and it's consistent across the board.
Yeah, I agree. Having that would be helpful. And I guess the question would be, is that something that we would want in the ordinance, or is that something that we could even provide as on the application, stating that these are the things that we're going to be looking at and evaluating to determine feasibility of rock in this situation?
Nick, I think Angie Berg, one thing we could do is the ordinance could reference a fact sheet or application and just at least have the ordinance identify that there's going to be criteria, and then the criteria can be listed in that supplemental information.
I like that, and just keep it simple. Bullet points of the considerations that are key that will be reviewed, so that if I'm Joe Schmo property owner, I can easily understand it. I can look at the document and, okay, cool, these are the things that are going to be the important factors, so I know what this is being determined on.
Yeah, and again, the challenge on this stuff is how do we build in more carrot, you know, and so we're using less stick. some way to create incentives here. And I'm not particularly helpful in that regard, but let's keep thinking along those lines.
Well, I think when we talk about impervious surfaces later and things like that, we might have some opportunities there that might allow people to have a patio area or something that maybe, if you wouldn't have, a quality near shore area, maybe you wouldn't have those things. So that could kind of build in some potential incentives.
Let's not forget, we're not the only player involved in this. We're the only player that on this particular narrow aspect of it. But you have the watersheds and you have the state regulations and so forth. If what we come up with can somehow telescope into what they're doing, that's great. Realizing, of course, that what they're doing and how they structure this is subject to change, just like our part of it is.
Well, and Lee, I think one of the small carrots in here too is that if somebody chooses to use a bioengineered solution, they wouldn't need to get a permit. And that certainly could be a big draw for some folks. I mean, I go back to what Jason and Joe and others have said. I mean, education will be key, because if they don't know they can do that, it won't matter. But there's at least, I think we should, at least we're starting to see some carrots in there, Lee.
All right, if there's no other discussion here, we can move on to retaining walls. So on retaining walls, again, we want to try to make it easy. We've heard that a lot tonight here, try to make it easier for property owners to understand the requirements. And then some of the discussion too from the last time was we wanted to think about retaining walls maybe a little bit differently in areas that are steeper slopes or in bluffs or that are right next to the water. Think about those a little bit differently and kind of build in some flexibility as compared to walls that are maybe further away from those sensitive areas. So here again, some kind of examples of some walls that we've seen across the county. So here we've got two options. We wanted to address retaining walls in a little different way. Option one addresses the most sensitive areas on riparian lots and prohibits walls in these areas. So in the shore impact zone and the bluff impact zone. This option is very easy to understand and prioritizes the reduction of the environmental impact in these areas. If somebody did want to propose a wall here, a variance would be required. And then outside of these areas, we could just keep our current retaining wall standards, because those would be further back from the water or not in a bluff and not in as sensitive of an area. Option two provides an avenue to obtain the walls in these areas, but it must be done for purposes other than just for ornamental reasons, and then it would have the engineering requirement as well. Currently, the ordinance does allow walls in the shore impact zone and on steep slopes. Regardless of whether they're for ornamental purposes or not, and that kind of goes for anywhere. Walls can be just proposed for ornamental reasons. Some counties, some counties do allow that and some don't. Some of those examples were provided. So any thoughts on retaining walls?
Yeah, I'll chime in again just to get things started. So look at this. I kind of like option number two of the three that are listed. But in reviewing the other counties, I did like the first sentence that Douglas County had in their section C on retaining walls. I like some of that language. It says it may be allowed where there's a demonstrated need. The design is consistent with the existing uses in the area, and it's not an aesthetic intrusion upon the land. again, it's kind of vague, but what it does allow is some flexibility in the case of a shoreline that, 30 years ago had a bunch of retaining walls put in, and now you have that property owner that might be fixing or redoing something and saying, well, this has been done for 30 years, why can't I? That language allows a little bit more for that flexibility, but yet it still, I think, is kind of consistent with what is stated in option 2, in that retaining walls proposed in the shoreline impact zone or steep slopes may only be authorized when the following is applied. It's not used for ornamental purposes, and then it has the other 4-foot thing. So if there's a way to merge some of that language with 2, I think it might just strengthen it a little bit more.
This is Jeff Mergen. I've had a lot of issues with retaining walls and complaints from people, especially where does the measurement start from? And that has been a big problem for the last 10 years. I guess I'm opposed to whatever the part that is under the ground, it has to be there to keep it in place as being part of the measurement.
Yeah, I do have that on the next slide here. We can talk about that a little bit. I've got the current ordinance language for the wall height and how that's defined. We can discuss that now if we wanted to. So in the ordinance, it states that the wall height is, as it pertains to this section, is measured from the bottom of the retaining material to the top of the cap as measured from the highest point of the wall, and shall include the height of all components constituting the wall.
So, Nick, this would be a change from our current standard, right?
Right. So here, the current standard would be to include the height of all of the components of the wall, which would include what's at the bottom that, may or may not be visible as part of the wall. So if we wanted to change it to just what's visible, that would be a change from what's written in the ordinance.
So then how do we measure the
recommendation?
How do we measure the below ground portion?
Well, if it's consistent with the design that's submitted, we would have something to go off of that. Otherwise, it may not be measured the same all of the time. If there are portions that are not visible, that aren't caught or aren't measured, that might be an oversight on inspections. But especially on shorter walls, not as much of is figured in below the grade. So, but on larger walls, obviously there would be more below grade wall height.
I'm in favor of measuring only the visible part, because that's where I've had most of the issues with constituents.
Commissioner Persky, I would have no problem allowing for a 1-foot footing, and then saying that anything exceeding that, can be subtracted from the height of the wall. Because I guess I don't, I see it necessary probably to have a, some of the wall has to be underneath the surface of the ground, and so anything that would exceed a foot underneath the ground can be subtracted from the height of the wall. So if we have 4 feet, they can have a 5-foot wall with a 1-foot footing and 4 feet exposed.
I don't think 1 foot is enough for most of the walls. 1 foot underground for stabilization.
Yeah, you're ignoring the fact that footings for foundations go below the measurement, or the desired depth is below the frost line. Why would that suddenly change because you're not doing a foundation, you're doing a retaining wall? I think I agree that 1 foot, you're building in obsolescence into your project.
Yeah, I don't think either there's one specific, because you have to really know what kind of material is underneath that to even put that wall up.
Absolutely. Soil conditions vary, even within a couple feet on lakeshore sometimes.
Yeah. What you guys are referring to is why you'd want that to be engineered. I mean, the reality is that's a really expensive venture for a property owner to undertake. When you start talking soil borings and then engineering, you're at $5,000 to $6,000 before you hire a contractor or even apply for your permit. Now, so that's the downside from, if you look at it, these being requirements, and I'm a property owner and I'm looking at $6,000 before I even touch the dirt, that part kind of bites if you're a property owner. But on the flip side, that's exactly the purpose of not having retaining walls failing, which we end up seeing, and the debate back and forth about what should the wall height be or what should the depth of the foundation be. So I think it's a necessary evil.
So from a technical standpoint, this is Greg Berg. The one thing you have to consider is whether it's below ground or above ground. Once you get 4 feet cumulative all on one wall, you always need, no matter the soil type or not, some type of tieback. And so that's where a lot of times that 4 foot number comes from. And so you got to be careful, I think, a little bit of how much you're going to allow them to put underground and then still be able to allow them to have above ground. Because once you get over that 4 foot height from a technical aspect, then you got to start tying it back in every block or layer you go up. And that creates a lot of room constraints as well as cost and potential engineering like Jason brought up. So you just got to be careful, I think, of how much we box people in a corner.
So, Greg, to that point, and you make a good point there, because you're getting into the engineering aspects of the landscape design. I noticed Douglas County has 3 foot wall height, and it's maybe we can debate this all day long. They have a shorter wall height, which creates more challenges for some projects. We still have to define where does the wall start and stop. So this is a tricky one. I guess, Greg, Jeff, you mentioned a lot of questions you run into on walls. What would be your suggestion for language that would eliminate the most questions but not put people in a corner where they're $6,000 in before they touch a project?
I'm not sure I have a real definite answer for that, but I don't think people will put more in the ground than they really need to stabilize their situation. That's why my feeling is we should say 4 feet above the ground. And if you want engineering involved in saying, in this case, if you want that much above the ground, how much needs to be underneath? I don't know exactly how to word that. Maybe they would only want 3 feet above the ground, depending upon what they need to stabilize it. It's just like the farmer that has told me when you're spreading manure, says, I don't want to spread more on a field than I need because it's wasting money. And it's the same concept here. So you got to trust people a little bit that they're going to do what's best for their situation.
Good point. Greg, on that aspect, in your experience, if you were to measure 4 feet above, from slope to, from slope to slope or whatever. I'm struggling for terms. It's late in the day already. But does that create failure issues in your experience with if it is a foot or 18 inches below grade?
Well, in general, I mean, I'm generalizing, but what happens is that you consider all of that wall height, no matter if it's below ground or not, and what most people are missing out on, and this isn't anything against what Commissioner Mergen is saying, but most people, even the contractors, are missing out on is they're just trying to stack up blocks or stack up rocks. And they're forgetting the part that, sure, you can have a good base underground, but if it gets too high and you don't tie it back in, it's all for naught. Yep. So that's kind of the basic thing that really needs to be addressed, not necessarily the part of how much is going below grade or above grade. It's just how much is total there. And that's not trying to be a stickler. That's just a general rule for retaining walls. And that's why you see all this language that teeters on that 4 foot. And that's probably why Douglas County has it at 3, so they just don't even have to really deal with it. That's my guess.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I would throw it doesn't make sense to go making it simple and clear to understand. Is it smarter to go 3.5 feet or something that's less than 4, or is 4 sufficient? But then just say grade to grade. Everyone can understand that and make it simple.
Angie Berg, I'm just jumping in here. I was looking at a couple of the recent applications that you've seen in the last year for retaining wall projects, and they range from 1 block below grade and to 3 blocks. And that was just a quick look at 3 of the most recent applications you've seen at the Planning Commission.
Were those typical 8-inch blocks, Angie? Or were they 12 inches?
On the 2, I found they were 12. The other one, that wasn't a great plan, so I didn't have a size dimension on the 3rd plan.
Okay. Thank you.
One way you could look at this is Greg again, and if it kind of addresses a lot of the issues that have come up with what Commissioner Mergen is hearing, is that maybe just try to address what's above ground, like what has normally been done. And like Nick said, you're not going to go out there with a pitchfork and try to figure out exactly how far down every one of these is went, probably. Not like you're trying to avoid anything. But most of them probably aren't going to dig down all that far. They're going to put in just the minimal amount of block that they need to and move on, so it doesn't bury a bunch of block that they're paying for and it's extra cost. So maybe somewhere between that 3.5 to 4 feet is enough above grade, and then just allow it to be some type of language that says, we need to review what that is below grade, or we allow X amount below grade, and if it's more than that that's proposed, it needs to be engineered, or, something like that. I don't know. Something that addresses that it's out of hand.
This is Angie Berg. I guess I don't hear anybody objecting to what Commissioner Mergen is suggesting and what Greg is suggesting could be a possible option. We don't need to wordsmith the ordinance tonight, I think, and not to rush, but I think the other discussion that Nick just flipped to is very important for tonight as well, because depending on what option you choose, you as a Planning Commission and County Board could very well see a whole lot less projects for retaining walls, depending on the level of restriction you go with.
Cool. We can keep moving.
All right, yeah, so kind of go back to the two options that were laid out here. We want to look at being more restrictive in the shoreline impact zone or in the bluff impact zone. These two options kind of get to that. Is that something that we want to look at doing, or just kind of keep the status quo on what we have?
Well, I'll vote for number 2.
This is Sean. I like 2 as well.
This is Jason Wienerman. Just a clarification on 2B. We're talking about cumulative, right?
Correct, yep.
Okay. I would concur with my fellow planning commission members on 2.
Yeah, this is Rich. I agree with number 2.
I think 2B should be part above grade.
Yeah, it seems like we kind of have a consensus on that and kind of general agreement that I think we can incorporate that language in the definition part of what constitutes the wall height, and then that would then by default translate into 2B as well.
Commissioner Persky, in number 2A, it says the wall is not used for ornamental purposes to alter topography. We always get, well, the hillside is failing, and that's what we hear. The reality is that the hillside isn't failing. They just want to put the wall in there so they can have a fire pit and a patio. That's why they want to put the walls in. So my question is, in the impact zone, are we going to just allow that? Is that going to be okay? Because in number 1, it's prohibited. In number 2, it says should not be ornamental purposes or alter topography. Well, what if they just want to put in that fire pit and that patio right by the shoreline? Are we going to allow them to put the walls in? Yes or no?
Yeah, so that's the difference between the two here. And if it meets in number 2, if it meets these, in this specific scenario, if it meets these 2 conditions, then yeah, it would be allowed, and that would allow them to be installed. But on number 1, it'd be prohibited in those areas. So if it met those 2 conditions on A and B, then yeah, we would permit that.
So do we have any setback then for that patio from the shoreline?
As of right now, no, but if we did change it in the impervious section that we'll get to here a little bit later, that would be a potential. There would be potentially, either a setback or a minimum or a size requirement or something, but right now there isn't. There's no setback for a patio from a water body. There's no setback for a retaining wall from a water body. That's why we wanted to try to look at addressing, wall proximity to the water through like the shore impact zone or bluff impact zone to the sensitive areas. But number 2 gives them the option to, an avenue to obtain the walls, but we have restrictive conditions that they must meet in order to make it happen.
Nick, Angie Berg, just to make a comment to Commissioner Persky's earlier statement. Almost all of you have contacted me at least once in the last 10 years and said, how can they ask to do something like this? Well, and like this means, how can they ask to put a retaining wall on their whole shoreline 20 feet high or 16 feet high, whatever it is? And the reason is because we're allowing it by a conditional use permit. And that's a fine option. And if that's the option that you want to keep, along with adding a few more restrictions, then option 2 would be your best bet. If, as Commissioner Persky stated, you don't want to be the judge and jury of retaining walls and shoreline, then you prohibit it and it's not allowed. So I just have to say that because I want to make sure everyone understands the difference between the 2 and that you will still see wall applications if you choose number 2, which is fine as long as that's clear.
Folks, I have to check out for what I hope is only a few minutes because my signature is required on some documents that have nothing to do with my public job. So if I understand the technology and I execute it correctly, I will be back. See you later, folks.
Angie or Nick, under number 2, this I guess goes back to one of Joe's questions. They would have to show that it really would be not altering the topography, right? I mean, I know that people right now are just saying it. Who's the burden on, or how is that determined if we go with number 2?
Yeah, so the burden would be on them. Yeah, so the burden would be on, we're proposing a retaining wall and then a flat area downslope of the wall that wasn't there previously. I think that's pretty clear that that would not be, or that would be altering the topography, and then that wouldn't meet the condition, and then it wouldn't be allowed. So
given that that's happening, I guess going back to Joe's question or point, would there be something additional in guidance for them about that? I'm just trying to make sure if part of the hope is to see less, even though I understand that number 1, there would be significantly less than number 2, is there something else that can be given to them that would not be in this definition that might make it less likely that some of the kind that Joe you're talking about would wind up in front of the Planning Commission? Or not really?
Not that I've seen. If people want a retaining wall or they want to create a flat area, they're going to propose it.
And then they're going to claim that it's for a different reason than it really is.
Right. They'll check the box that it's to, do this or do that. There's not really much you can do to stop that. I mean, even the education aspect, you go through, well, erosion's happening here because you don't have vegetation here or something like that, or stormwater's being directed through this area, or any number of reasons. When they look around sideways at at other properties and things, they might have certain ideas, but kind of getting back to that point that every property is a little bit different, and each site's a little bit different. That needs to be considered as well. But I don't know that there's. I wrestled with this a lot, and I looked at a lot of the other county language and what other LGUs have, and I didn't see anything that would persuade or dissuade potential applicants from requesting additional retaining walls.
Could there be something, and Jason, I almost want to say, does Douglas County have this? But could there be something else that's put in there that they would, that if it was feasible, they'd have to essentially either try or utilize one of those other types of solutions instead of a retaining wall? I mean, is there something that we could do with that, or is that just add a whole other layer that makes it unwieldy?
Well, I think when we look, I don't know. Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I was going to say, I think you make a good point. I think that's why, to me, I still kind of go towards 2 versus 1. 1 is just completely restrictive, and if you don't allow anything, people want this. And so now we're going to be dealing with more violations. If at least we see them, that's some of the stuff that can be vetted then. So, hey, you want a fire pit within this proximity. Rather than doing a retaining wall, you got enough distance. Can you slope and put a vegetative deal there instead of a wall? I mean, there might be other options that make sense based on the property, and this process hopefully allows that to be vetted, in my opinion. But
would it make sense then perhaps to have, I don't know if it's, between A and B or somewhere else in there, something that basically says that the priority will be, or the default is one of these. Something, so if I'm looking at it, I'm the property owner, I say, oh, okay, I got to go see if this is feasible for my property first before I'm bringing it, but it doesn't prohibit it. might there be some kind of like, we don't have to wordsmith now, or does that, or in a separate thing that would give some guidance? I'm a little worried that it's still too muchy, frankly.
Well, I guess I'm concerned about putting the retaining walls into bluffs. Also, I guess is it contradictory of terms not to disturb the topography? Well, I can't imagine putting a wall into a bluff without changing the topography. How would you do that?
Joe, you're right, though. I mean, to that point, I think that's why it has to follow the CUP process. So you look at it. So if you get something where it's completely changing the topography, it says right in the guidelines that that's not allowed. Versus, there can be some appropriate ways to do that, and where the property owner still, achieves their objective, and you're not altering the topography and trying to build a retaining wall into a bluff. Some of the stuff just is going to, I think, have to be vetted by the process. I like Terrell's suggestion in having, preferred options, and maybe it's listed as a supplement, like we had talked about with the other portion when it comes to riprap. Is that, hey, here's the preferred methods, or these are the criteria that it'll be judged on. That language might be good to add. To deal with what you guys are kind of getting at.
And that supplementary information, that can be reviewed when we do our pre-application site visit with the property owner. And that can be reviewed at that time, and it's a great, that education aspect can happen then. So.
I'm back.
So we heard a fair amount of support for number 2, and then we can explore adding kind of that preferred options for that. Are there any other thoughts on that? If not, we can move on to topographic alterations. So at the last meeting, we had a little bit of discussion on this. It didn't seem to be as much of a priority as some of the other areas. Kind of keeping with the theme, though, of looking at the most sensitive areas. That kind of area we would look at would be fill placement in the impact zone or in the bluff impact zone. We wanted to make sure that we think about kind of these alterations that have the most impact, while still allowing some flexibility to allow for projects that do not have substantial environmental impacts. So in option 1, it would prohibit fill in the shore impact zone and bluff impact zone unless it was authorized by some kind of restoration project with an agency like the DNR, SWCD, NRCS, or a watershed district. If a variance were applied for and granted, additional mitigation conditions could include things like more intensive vegetation buffer requirements, enhanced erosion control, or other specific site conditions. This option would only consider fill placement itself, so we're not talking about like ice ridge removal or things like that. That would happen on more of like a yearly or every few years kind of basis on some properties. This would just be for fill in these areas. Another option here would be to require a permit for any alteration in these areas. We talked a little bit about how the 10 cubic yards can turn into more than 10 cubic yards pretty easily on some of these projects. That 10 cubic yard exemption currently covers these areas that 10 cubic yards on a bluff can cause problems pretty quickly. So requiring a permit would help reduce loss of buffers in different areas, but would still allow for the project to happen. So that kind of builds in a little bit of flexibility there. And option 3 could be done in conjunction with either 1 or 2. This one's more about just talking about number one, the threshold. So if we wanted to use like a 10 yards or a 5 yards, or if we wanted to change that, or if we wanted to refer to the disturbed area in a different way. We talked a little bit about how cubic yards isn't as easy for some people to understand as maybe a defined area, like a square footage amount. So there are any thoughts on this part? I know in the last meeting wasn't as much of a priority, but this might be one of the only areas for excavation, fill, and grading.
Yeah, good thing started again. I had reviewed what other counties do, and there seems to be a lot more variation in what other counties do when it comes to this area. And we do I like 2 and 3 in conjunction, and it looked like 10 yards seemed to be to me a fair amount. You're talking about like a 27 foot by 10 foot area. To me, seems manageable and reasonable. Opinion of one.
Number 2, when you talk about in the shoreline impact zone, the bluff impact zone, or on steep slopes, with those steep slopes, is that a broad definition of steep slopes? Or is that steep slopes adjacent to water?
So that would be steep slopes within the setback area of the water body. Okay. So if it was beyond the setback area, it wouldn't be.
Okay.
It wouldn't matter.
Which on an undeveloped lot, Nick, is 100 feet, right?
It's 100 feet on recreational development lakes, and it would be 100 feet, 75 feet for general development, and 200 feet for natural environment lake.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for clarifying.
Any other thoughts here? We got a couple kind of in favor of 2. Any other thoughts or discussion? If not, we can kind of go ahead with that. Sand blankets are next. So these are the current sand blanket standards. Yep, go ahead.
Can I just ask a question going back? So when you say buffer, let's see, if no vegetation buffer exists between the project area and the water body, one must be established as part of the project. So if that's in the plan, do you guys have to go back the next year or the year after and make sure it actually is growing and is actually there?
Yeah, so we would do we do the re-inspections already for the projects. So when we do that, it's usually the year after. Some of them will be in the fall if they get complete the project in the summer, early enough in the summer. But a lot of times it's almost a full year after when we go out there, and then that's when we would check that to see if that's there. That vegetation buffer aspect. The reason why I wanted to include that here is because right now we allow projects, even if it's only 10 yards, that can, 270 square feet can be excavated out 6 inches and added 6 inches of fill. The vegetation's decimated there, and that's all part of the shoreland project. And it could be as close as right next to the water body. And we don't have anything preventing that vegetation loss right next to the water. So it could be removing vegetation that's already there, or it could be creating a significant, fairly significant disturbed area with no vegetation buffer between the water body and the project. So, we've seen a number of quite a fair number of these in the past few years, and where people want to add fill to create that flat spot or whatever, right by the water, and there's really nothing preventing that loss of the vegetation as the ordinance kind of allows for currently.
I just wanted to had a question on the follow-up. If somebody has to go back and look, I mean, if I put it in my plan, all of a sudden it's not there and nobody ever checks. So it's kind of what alluded to on some of the other issues where, I got by with it and, that type of thing. That's why I was just wondering if you had to re-inspect when you had required a buffer or a vegetative buffer. Because a lot of times you don't grow right away. You have to wait.
Yep. It might take a couple of years for it to really become established again. But if somebody was mowing right to the water or not allowing the vegetation to be established, well, then there would be no buffer there, and then that would need to be addressed.
Okay, thanks.
Nick, Commissioner Notch, I was just going to comment on that. Nick hit on this a little bit earlier as well. So the ordinance also has a provision that if you're in violation of a particular standard, which in this case they could be in violation of not having a buffer, that we're not authorized to issue any permits for the property. So as Nick indicated, yes, we would do our inspection follow-up the next year, but we're not going to keep going back and back and back. We don't have the staff time to do that. But what we would do is the next time that person applies for a permit, let's say to replace their deck, we would look and see, okay, are you complying with your previous permits? And if they did not have the buffer, we would work with them on getting that fixed.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Maybe this is too broad a question, but how many of these permits have we been experiencing over the last several years?
I think I had those numbers in the first packet, right around 60 a year, I believe.
And a hand grenade estimate is fine.
Okay.
Commissioner Lensmeyer, Angie Berg, typically it's between 45 and 60 in any given year. And as far as major shoreline alteration permits or the ones that you and the Planning Commission see, I'll just look that up real quick. It wasn't a whole lot this year. Maybe a handful.
I believe it was like four majors this year, something like that.
Yep, exactly. It was 4. I just looked at that. Yep.
It's more than the number of sand blanket permits we've had this year. So one thing here, we talked about a couple different things about maybe reasons why there aren't a lot of permits that are applied for sand blankets. Then another aspect here too is maybe trying to simplify it a little bit and then looking at the cost for the permit. Right now we kind of have 2 different size standards for sand blankets. If it requires excavation, it's maximum 10 by 30 or half the lot width. Or if there's no excavation, it's 10 by 50. The vast majority of these have excavation of some sort in order to kind of create a flatter area. So one option here would kind of be to standardize this section to make it easier for people to understand the standardized sand blanket size. 25-foot lot width or 25 feet or 25% of the lot width would be in line with what various other counties, even local counties, have. The other reason why 25 feet might make sense here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is it's kind of in line with what the Soil and Water Conservation District utilizes for a kind of a access path and an area to the water. And we'll talk about that more with our vegetation alteration standards. So this kind of makes it a little bit more clear, and it's still reasonable in line with what other counties are doing. and it could align well with other things that we're looking at as well. So any thoughts on sand blankets here, or this kind of size requirement?
I like the amendment option. Number one that you have listed, it is consistent with others, and it still seems very reasonable.
I think it's easier to understand for people too, which I think was part of your goal.
You know, that's a consider. You're cutting on those small lots, though. You are cutting the sand blankets down considerably. You know, I'm one for protecting the environment, but also I know a lot of folks are on older lots that were developed quite a few years ago. And so, you know, we had 50% of the lot width in the old one. Now we're going down to 25% of the lot width. Some of those folks that might be sitting on 40 and 50-foot lots really don't get much of a sand blanket. Just throwing it out there.
Yeah, one easy way to fix that would be to say 25 feet or 50%, whichever is less. Then that way on those smaller lots, they would still get
25 feet.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, or
less.
Yeah.
Again, I would be 25% would be pretty restrictive on those small lots. So I would have a little concern on that.
Good suggestion, Joe.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, yeah, we could just change that percent. And then the other thing to keep in mind here too is if they have something that's existing that was permitted previously, they're able to keep that as it was permitted, you know, even if that is 30 or more than the 25 or whatever the new standard would be. So that also allows for that. All right, next on the docket here is impervious surface. So we talked about last time a little bit. We don't limit the impervious surface beyond the statewide minimum 25% lot coverage requirement. So, you know, they can go in, there's no setback from a water body either, you know, so we're seeing things like this where the patios, you know, kind of getting parked right next to a water body. So there's a couple different ways we could address this. One option here would be to prohibit impervious surfaces with the exception of water-oriented accessory structures. So those are the 150 square foot structure that the property can have without a permit. So those would be exempted, and then as well as any kind of access path to the water in the impact zone or in the bluff impact zone. So this would essentially just kind of prevent the patios from getting placed in the shore impact zone, which is half the building setback of whatever lake class it is. Option two would be a little bit more flexible and would allow the property to choose how that 150 square foot of impervious that's currently designated for the water-oriented accessory structure would allow people to choose, you know, whether to have a shed or a patio or maybe a combination of both, but kind of limit it to that 150 square feet so that it's not both, you know, the water-oriented structure and an additional patio like we're seeing now. So, you know, both options 1 and 2 reduce, you know, the environmental impact because it's restricting the impervious cover. Option 3 would be a slightly less restrictive option than number 2, where it allows for the water-oriented accessory structure like we currently have at 150 square feet. And then we would define an area that would be allowed, you know, as a maximum for impervious cover in the impact zone. So, you know, they have their 150 square foot shed, and then maybe they have a 50 square foot patio or whatever number that might be. And then that patio would need to have some kind of buffer between the water body and the patio. Otherwise, you know, it could just lead to, you could park it right next to the lake, kind of like what we've seen on some. So, this would require a permit. Otherwise, there'd be no way to really ensure the compliance of it. It could be a general standard. I guess it wouldn't necessarily need to have a permit, but the other thing here is the native buffers can be difficult to enforce over time, but it is a way to kind of promote, addressing runoff to the water body directly in some way. So a couple different ideas here. Kind of curious to see what people's thoughts are. I know we had a fair amount of discussion on meeting one about this.
For me, it'd be between 2 and 3, and I appreciate flexibility. Maybe 3 is more flexible than 2. And then another thought that struck me, I don't know why this popped into my head, but God created Earth in a day, and look at all the time we're taking to regulate it. That's a joke, folks. Just stick with me. That's a joke.
It's a tough crowd. Tough crowd.
I like it. I was going to mention I like 2. I like parts of 3 though as well. So I'm okay. I like the buffer side or portion of it. If you're going to put an impervious surface in that area, I like the idea of a buffer between it, so you're not having water running straight into the lake or river. So I back and forth, but I like the 150 square feet flexibility. The one tricky part with both of these, with 2 and 3, is that it's really hard because every lot's different again. I mean, for a giant lot, 1 or 2 acre parcel, doing a couple things probably isn't out of the realm. You put yourself on those previous small little lots like we talked about earlier with the sand blanket thing, and 150 feet might be way too much considering the lot. That's the tricky part, and I don't know if there's ways to wordsmith that a little bit to modify things as a percentage or something just to add into it. But in spirit, I like 2 or 3.
Nick, what did we have for existing on this?
So we don't really have anything regulating patios in the impact zone currently, other than the fact that they have to be within 12 inches of grade, which if it's flat or if they had done an alteration in past years and they have a relatively flat area, there's not a size limitation or a setback limitation. So there's really not much right now.
What about structure, though? What about a shed or a boathouse, or, this just says impervious surface. Where are we with structure?
So the water-oriented accessory structures need to be at least 10 feet from the ordinary high water level and 10 feet from the property lines.
Okay.
So those are the requirements for those.
This is Sean. I'm going to have to say that I do like 3, but would certainly settle for 2. But 3 is I love the buffer aspect of it and making that a requirement and dealing with the water runoff.
Yeah, I really liked that part of 3 as well. Been kind of wrestling in my head, like a few of you've said out loud already, about the size of the lot and what's there. And so the rest of that, I'm guessing somebody else will have a better idea than me. But one of the things I really do like about 3 is it's a really good way to be helping kind of win-win, right? They're going to be able to do something they want to do, and we're going to be able to get much better practice there. So I think that's, talk about a carrot, right? But I was wondering, since we've talked about it in with a couple of these other conversations, is there a way where it is up to a certain amount depending upon the size of those tiny ones, I agree. It doesn't matter if it's a huge one, but it does matter if it's a little one. I don't know if there's additional guidance we could give with that. So that's where in my head I was kind of going back and forth between 2 and 3, but I really do like the buffer.
Yeah, and the other aspect to talk about too, a little bit here is it's kind of apparent a little bit on 2, but definitely on 3. You're still it's a lot easier to say, you know, it maybe can't go here, but how about back over here and provide a buffer, rather than saying it can't happen at all. It's a lot easier to, you know, kind of gain acceptance with that and understanding of, well, number one, why it's done, but just number 2, being okay with that. As you know, as a condition or as something that needs to be met. So
Nick, I have a question. This is Greg. If you were to do this and they didn't have a water-oriented accessory structure, could they add the 150 square feet from that to the 50 that's allowed in the option 3 to get 200 square feet total of a patio or something like that instead of a building? Or can they just do the 150 square feet and then not have to do a buffer?
yeah, so that would, you know, depend on how we would want to word it and what we want to allow. The way it is currently, you know, they bid the 150. They could do it without a buffer because, we'd only have the 10-foot setback requirement, so there'd be no buffer requirement there. And then the way it's worded now, just that additional 50 would need the buffer.
I'm going to chime in real quick, Angie Berg. So, and Sean can.
more of just a placeholder there to say that the concept of number 3 is hey, we'd allow the 150 square foot shed, and then we would also allow up to a certain amount as another impervious surface, as either a patio of some sort or some kind of impervious surface, in addition to the 150 square foot shed, whether that was built first or second.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess, get back to kind of the motive of what we were looking at here is, trying to limit these bigger patios parked right next to the water and trying to figure out a way where we can maybe limit that or, prevent that from happening to some extent. Well, maybe even, still allowing for a patio space, but making it a more manageable size closer to the water, or saying it needs to get pushed back away from near the water. It needs to be put back a little bit further so that it doesn't cause a runoff issue into the water body or onto a neighbor's property or something like that. So that's kind of the motive here. And
so Nick,
coming up with what those numbers should be can be a challenge.
Yeah, right on. But 2 and 3 can run in conjunction, correct? And so if we put 3 in basically, a 5 by 10, I would probably bump that up a little bit, maybe to another 150 feet or something, allow for a 10 by 15 or at least a 10 by 10. Maybe it's a 100 square foot shed. So we can debate that one, but I would be a fan of 2 and 3 and up that square footage on number 3 to a degree. And I'd throw 150 out there as well.
So if I understand that right, what Jason's saying is we would have the 150 square foot water-oriented structure as it's existing, and then in addition to that, there could be a patio or some sort of impervious for another 150 square feet. That wouldn't be considered a structure. It couldn't be another shed. It would have to be something that's within 12 inches of grade. So then there could be a total of up to 300 square feet of impervious with a 150 square foot shed and then a 150 square foot patio in the short impact zone.
And all of this then would still, they still have to be under 25% impervious for the lot. So, for some of those real small lots, hopefully that portion of it takes care of some of this issue.
So then
go ahead.
Did Jason just propose doubling the allowable impervious in the short impact zone?
No, right now we don't limit it. We don't have a maximum other than the 25% for the total lot. We just have the 150 square foot water-oriented structure.
Okay, thanks.
Jason, to a degree though, I did in the additional building. So in essence, if there was an additional structure, it would have doubled. I guess it still wouldn't have quite doubled if there was a number 3 allowed 50 feet. It'd have been a tripling of that 50 foot.
Okay, I see where you're going.
So I'm guessing if we do this, and I recognize by saying this is going to be very obvious, that we'll need to, with guidance, make it very obvious that the 25% is still, right, that's still there. Because otherwise somebody's going to go through what we just did. So, yep, not more than 25%. Now you can look at the rest of this. You're over 25 or you're at 25. Nope, don't go here. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And including the buffer, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And would we want to change that to maybe 20 feet to be more consistent? Like we could say 20 feet for the buffer width?
Yeah.
I like it.
I like 20.
Okay, so kind of seems like we allow the water-oriented accessory structure of 150 square feet. We allow a impervious area like a patio or a deck of some sort of up to 150 square feet, and then there needs to be at least a 20-foot buffer of native vegetation between the water body and that 150 square foot patio or deck area. Does that sound right to everybody?
That would sound good, Nick, but and as the ordinance is written, it wouldn't be hurt if we had it highlighted or at least an asterisk that this would be included in the 25% of total impervious.
Sure, yeah, that can be added.
Oh, Nick, this is Greg. I'm just going to go back to my one question, though. If they take the 150 square feet for the water-oriented accessory structure and add it to this new 150 square feet of impervious and just do all of patio, do they only have to buffer half of it then?
That's a good question. That's not clear as it's stated right now.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. I think the intention would be they have to buffer the entire thing. That's the way I would look at that.
We could state that any patio area needs to have the buffer. And then the last point here too is that, so it's kind of mentioned whether to have a permit for this or not. Right now, there's no permit required for patio areas or any impervious surface like that. There's no permit required for the water-oriented accessory structure. If we did require a permit for it, it would allow for better explanation and kind of follow up on the buffer, but it might also, the number of permits that would be received for it, it's kind of a question of whether or not that would be a worthwhile endeavor. So then that's the question of, is that something we want to require a permit for or not? Given what we've kind of described here, it may or may not be useful.
You know, Nick, it's a good question. Some of these things are very much, or would fall within a do-it-yourselfer kind of a category, but you want people to understand the rules and the guidelines. So I'm wondering if we look at it from the perspective that we did with the sand blankets, and maybe have it a permitted deal, but at a different rate than if you're putting in a monstrous, project. So maybe a reduced rate permit similar to the sand blanket would be appropriate for this.
Yeah, I think good idea, Jason. Maybe a flat rate, and the whole concept here is to educate that do-it-yourselfer so that things are done correctly. That's what I think we'd get out of it.
And Nick, another thing, we might want to check with the watershed districts. They might have more stringent impervious surface requirements. So maybe if they get a WD permit, they don't need one of ours, if it's more stringent.
Yeah, I could follow up with some of the watershed districts on that to see how this would align with theirs. Okay. Right, so the next aspect here, we didn't talk a lot about specifically last time. We talked a little bit about the steep slopes and bluffs and things, but we didn't really talk about walkways to the water specifically. Achieving access to the water is something that property owners will want to achieve, but the standards aren't really explicitly stated on how to achieve this, or there's not like specific requirements for people to follow necessarily. We do have recommended guidance in the ordinance and from the DNR about the preferred method on steep slopes and bluffs to use stairways, lifts, and landings above the ground, but there's no requirement for people to use them on those steeper areas. So this looks at kind of requiring people to achieve lake access or river access or access to the water body on a steep slope or a bluff, to require them to use stairways, lifts, or landings constructed above ground rather than doing a topographic alteration of some sort or building steps into a slope as like an alternative. So some LGUs so option 1 introduces a permit requirement when constructing these access paths to the water body. Some LGUs do this already. The benefit here is that the access area can be permitted to be within an access or view corridor, like we kind of talked about with vegetation alterations, and we'll get to that next as well. And then information can also be provided about how to control erosion. If a permit's required for something like this, we'd want to keep it a low or no cost permit. Otherwise, here again, we don't want to require permits for something that's probably going to happen on a lot more lots, and it happens on most lots already. The 18% slope here is called out. That's a threshold here. That's consistent with the number that's used when determining bluff areas. So if it's an 18% or if it's less than 18% slope across a 50-foot section, it's not considered a bluff. So that would remain consistent with that aspect. Another option here would be to prohibit land alterations on slopes greater than like 18% that are used for water access and require above ground solutions. And there would be no permit requirement on option 2. So we had a little bit of discussion on the steep slopes and stuff, especially with the challenging lots that are out there that people are starting to develop. You have any thoughts on something like this? There aren't a lot of other counties that do this. Most of them have the stock language about the preferred method of using above ground stairways, lifts, and landings, but they don't necessarily spell out what to use over a certain percent slope.
I'll get started. I like 1 and 2, obviously, actually in conjunction. If there's going to be something that you want to put in the ground and it meets the requirements, there's a permit for it. Anything else is you don't need a permit to do. And thus it being kind of that carrot that others referred to earlier in taking the preferred method route. I'm a fan. The way the amendment options are listed.
So it would be a permit situation if they were going to be doing something in the ground, but if they were just going to be doing something above ground, it wouldn't be a permit.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it. Maybe I did it incorrectly, but I thought it made sense.
Any other thoughts on that? The biggest change there in that situation would just be requiring the permit for that. And then as part of that, we would make sure that we would address erosion control issues because of the steep slope. Another great way to provide some education on the benefits of that, controlling erosion, and it would be an incentive for people to use the preferred method.
Nick, if I'm looking at this right, it says require permit of impervious, but it says also and prohibit land alterations for access. Would that be by prohibiting land alterations? Would that mean they couldn't then, if going back, they couldn't put a wall in? I mean, how would we allow them? We were saying they couldn't do steps, but back when we were doing the walls and we talked about bluffs, is a bluff, just looking at definition, is the bluff anything excess of 18% grade?
So the bluff the bluff would need to meet the height threshold above the ordinary high water level. It would need to meet, which is 25 feet, and then a 30% slope or greater to meet the bluff definition. So that's what the bluff would be. I think what you're reading here in number 2, like prohibiting the topographic alteration for the lake's access, this would only be in relation to the access path or stairs, whatever they were creating. So it would prohibit that land alteration to create that path to the water. I mean, so the idea is there that you're using the above ground methods that are preferred. You know, the DNR provides guidance on. That's the preferred methods that we had outlined in the ordinance already. Those don't require the land disturbance on the steep slopes. It's built above ground on posts or pilings.
Right.
It doesn't disturb the ground.
And I agree with that. Yes.
So I think with what Jason had kind of proposed here, it's slightly different than the 2 options. It's kind of a combination of both, but it's not necessarily prohibiting the land alteration. So it wouldn't be a variance. It would be a permit application. So they would need to apply for a permit, and we would need it's probably going to be a minor shoreline alteration permit unless they were disturbing above a threshold of amount of material that would trigger a conditional use permit. If they wanted to alter the topography on a steep slope or the bluff to make an access path. If they didn't want to do that and they didn't do that, it wouldn't be a permit situation. And they could use the preferred methods to achieve access to the water body.
What would be our criterion for denying them to, let's say, put in steps then, if they wanted to go ahead and go with a major shoreline alteration?
Well, it would be similar to what currently, would exist if there was a major shoreline alteration to cut out a swath of a bluff to create an altered slope. It would be very similar to what would be currently in place.
I guess I'm just a little bit confused. Are we going to allow that or not allow that?
Joe, I think that's where it would come down to. I think we have a process in place for reviewing those. In cases where it seems excessive, where someone's wanting to put some impervious steps in and it turns into this massive project in which they're excavating a bluff and all kinds of stuff, we would just deny recommendation of something like that. But if it made sense for whatever reason, based on the property, back to the spirit of the comprehensive plan and providing flexibility, maybe this particular lot, something does make sense to do it in a certain fashion, and we're cool with it, and it would get approved. But to some degree, the Planning Commission exists for that reason, is to vet some of those trickier cases.
And the other option, which is more kind of in the spirit of how these options are kind of laid out the way they are already, is if it's prohibited, it would become a variance. If somebody didn't want to do the preferred method on slopes above 18%, then they would need to apply for a variance and be granted the variance to install slopes into the ground, on a slope like that. So there's a little bit of a distinction between, I think, what maybe Jason had proposed here and how this is worded. It's the difference between a variance and a conditional use permit. If it's prohibited and they don't want to use the above ground, above 18% slope, the question, is it going to be a variance or is it going to be a conditional use permit?
And where do we exist at the present time? We exist at the variance level?
No, so at the present time, it would be a conditional use permit if they wanted to dig into a bluff, or steep slope like that. So not a lot would change necessarily if we were to go with kind of what we've been discussed.
Okay.
But the way that these two options kind of lay out here is if it's prohibited, it'd be more of it'd be a variance if people didn't want to construct the steps above ground, because that would be the method that would need to be done on slopes above 18%.
I'm listening. Are there any other opinions out there?
I'm confused.
So I guess maybe if I can attempt to simplify it a little bit, so currently we don't have any permits requirements for steps to a water body or any kind of access path, as long as it's 4 feet wide or less. There's dimension requirements, but we don't require a permit for that unless it's triggered by moving material. And if the material is being moved in a bluff area and it's a significant amount of material, it becomes a conditional use permit. And that's the only way a permit would be involved. And we don't require that people use above ground solutions for access. What these two options would do would be looking at, okay, on slopes above 18%, you either need to use above ground solutions that don't disturb the ground, or you need to apply for a variance and be granted a variance to achieve that access.
Jeff Mergen, does putting in steps disturb the ground?
So it depends on the design of the steps themselves and what, so whether there needs to be some sort of dirt work done before the steps go in. A very popular method now is using these large stone steps that are hundreds of pounds each, and those can disturb a little bit of a ground area. When you're talking a bluff area, it can be pretty significant if that's a longer slope.
What kind of steps would not be considered to disturb ground?
So the DNR guidance and the way it's worded in our ordinance currently is if they're on posts or pilings. So you're only making a post. The area of that post in the ground is the only area that's being disturbed, is that defined area, rather than the entire surface area of the steps themselves all the way down the slope.
So pounding a post in the ground is not considered as disturbing anything?
Correct.
Okay.
That wouldn't require a permit. Doesn't require a permit now, and it wouldn't require, if we did number 2, that wouldn't require a permit here. And that would be the preferred method, and the method that people would have to use if the slope is greater than 18%.
So, Nick, I mean, maybe make sure I'm understanding this right. But today, based on what we allow, I could call my buddy up, get a skid loader over, and we could, tear a couple areas down and plop some steps in, whether we put concrete in or stone steps. And you know what? Finish it, degrade it, but with a shovel, and we're totally within our rights, as long as we're not like going outside of our lake access, putting stairs in. But I could do that today.
Even if you were outside that lake access, it's not a permitted activity. We wouldn't, there's nothing. And if you met your 4-foot width or less, there'd be nothing,
exactly,
no regulation on it.
Yeah, it's a free-for-all today. And so what we'd be saying now is if you're going to do anything other than putting in stairways, which is the recommended or the preferred method, it would require a permit. And so, you know, Joe's point earlier, in some cases, if it's a major shoreline alteration to create access, well, it still follows that same process. But if we go the variance route, now I can't even take a shovel and put a couple stairs in, even if it, you know, is something that would have been simple enough for me to do. I have to go through the variance process to make sure I could put in a couple of small little concrete steps, you know, per the ordinance. So I don't know, to me, this seems like hopefully an improvement from what's there today, but still allow some flexibility for property owners.
Yeah, this sounds like we're killing flies with a hammer. There's got to be a better solution to this.
So, in my opinion, sometimes we overthink these maybe for the amount of times these come up, but maybe they come up more than we see as commissioners even, but.
Well, and I mean, the other option here is, you know, is always, you know, maybe it's sufficient in what we have. You know, we don't need to alter everything or amend every aspect of it, but it kind of came up in the discussion last week when talking about altering steep slopes. I've seen it a few different occasions where it has come up.
I have no trouble if they want to follow by putting in the pilings and putting it above ground. I have no trouble with them getting access without a permit. But if they're going to start digging in the ground and start destroying the bluff, then I'd like to see what they're going to do.
So maybe we just say it that way. We say no permit required if you're going above ground, but if you're going to be building on slopes greater than 18%, it requires a permit. And if it triggers the amount of material for a CUP, it's a conditional use permit.
Sounds good to me.
I'm totally fine with that.
Sounds like overkill.
Lee, what would you say? I mean, you just leave it as it is today?
Yeah, until we come up with a better idea. How often does this really happen? Let's start with that. I mean, are we working on a solution that's looking for a problem here? You know, realistically, you folks see this stuff, our staff see different applications or different ideas or, you know, different concepts. Maybe not every day, but quite often. How often does this happen?
Stairways on steep slopes and bluffs like this, I've seen maybe a handful over this last year and a half.
Commissioner Lenzmeyer, Angie Bird, I would also echo that the Planning Commission and the board have seen in a lot of the retaining wall proposals that you've seen for major shoreline alteration on a CUP have included the rock stairs, as Nick has indicated. And so I think that this, if you would go with the option of no permit for, you know, the posts and pilings, that would definitely probably discourage folks from asking for the big cutout down the middle and then your retaining walls on either side.
And Lee, what I like about that, again, it's another one of the carrot things. Here's something I can go, like, tell me what I can go do. What do I not need to come to get a permit for?
Okay.
what
Yeah.
makes sense. It's also encouraging the preferred practices, but that we're also not, we're allowing under a conditional use permit if there's something somebody really wants to try to do that maybe makes sense for their property. But personally, I like the, yep, go, you can go, you're gonna do a staircase with footings, go, you don't need us.
Okay.
There seems to be a general consensus on that aspect, so I think we can kind of go with that, move ahead with that part, and go about it that way. Next one here is vegetation alterations. We had a fair amount of discussion about this at the last one as well. It's been a long been a challenge, kind of in the way that we do it currently, where people would be allowed 25% removal within a 50-foot corridor or half the lot width, whichever is less. There's a lot of confusion among property owners about understanding that it's only 25% removal within a corridor and that it's not 100% removal, and there's just a lot of numbers, and it's not that easy for people to figure that out. So we talked about, we want to simplify this a little bit. We want it to be easier to explain, understand, and enforce. And an option to do that would be to reduce the size of the corridor to like 25 feet, to allow more intensive removal of up to 100% removal within that corridor. This makes it a lot easier to explain and understand. It's also more in line with what actually happens a lot of times, where people want to have access and be able to bring their docks or boat lifts or whatever into an area that it doesn't have any kind of trees or other vegetation. The other significance of the 25 feet is it matches the width that's allowed on soil and water conservation district projects, which kind of streamlines that aspect as well. It's easy. There's some continuity there. The only caveat to the 100% removal within the 25-foot corridor would be areas that are on bluffs or in steep slopes. We would still want to have some vegetation that remains so that we don't just have bare ground on an area like that. But in most situations, if it's not on a bluff, this is going to be a little bit more clear for people to understand and enforce as well. So, any thoughts on this one?
This is Sean. I like it. It's a nice compromise and it makes it easier.
So if somebody wants to replace vegetation on a bluff or a steep slope that isn't access, I mean, if they want to remove but replace, are they permitted to do that, or do they have to come and get a permit for that? Or is that?
So that would still be a permit. That would be part of the vegetation alteration. If they wanted to do vegetation replacement, it would still have to be a permit.
Yep.
To do that.
They might just need to have that clarified. I like it too.
I like the bundling of the access and view corridor in this. So you wind up minimizing the extent of the impact. I think that's a really good catch.
Yeah, and then we also had talked about on like new construction on riparian lots, how we would try to get this identified right away on the construction site permit application right away, so that that's identified and it doesn't become an afterthought later on or vegetation's removed. So we'll be able to identify this early on in the process and kind of keep track of that. But.
So is there no thought then, let's say in that whole area, is there a percentage they can thin out and not have a full open view?
Right. So this would not allow for the vegetation removal outside of that corridor.
I guess I'm
Unless-
thinking of trees. I don't know if, you know, not really thinking grass or, you know, whatever natural wildflowers or whatever, but I'm just thinking of trees.
Right, and that's where the difficulty comes in, because people start to prune and start to cut and start to thin out, and before we know it, it becomes thin or non-existent. And that's the kind of the challenge we even ran into in the 25% is, okay, we marked these trees, and when you go back, it's not as easy as it might seem. I mean, so we've got the trees marked, it's all documented, but getting to that 25%, or even if we were to do a percent outside of that corridor, it becomes very difficult to enforce, and people are tempted to remove more than they should. If we can kind of keep it to where people can really access and utilize that area to its fullest extent, and keep that synonymous with the view corridor, it really eliminates that creeping, you know, tree removal that we've seen on a lot of shoreline properties.
Okay. Yeah, my thought was more, yeah, it's just a hard measure, because if that whole 100 foot of mine was all trees, you know, and it was fairly thick, I'd say, well, I'll take this one over here, this one over there. I don't want people to look at my plate. I don't want to be wide open, exposed, but I just want to thin it. But I understand where it's a difficult situation then too. Because what's thin to me might not be thin to you. You know.
Nick, this is Greg, and I think one thing about it is, you know, if you take a branch here and there off a tree, nobody's going to come out there with the flashing lights either. And the other thing that I had mentioned to Nick is that I think not only the newly developed lots, but the existing lots, when you do meet with people, is start to establish a record. So at least you have something going forward that's in your database that here is where the view corridor at least was established with whoever you talked to the last time.
I guess I was going to say too, we can start with this, and we can always, you know, if issues keep coming up, we might just have to come back to it and say we got to think different again. But it's probably good enough for now.
Commissioner Notch, I would also like. Angie Berg, I was just going to echo Commissioner Notch's comments, and remember here that these are just recommendations moving forward to the public hearing process. And I would hope, I mean, we have some good ideas on engaging lake property owners, contractors, et cetera. So this is, I think what you said, probably a good start.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit concerned about saying no vegetation removal from a practical standpoint too. Say you've got an area on a lake where there's 3 lots that have not been developed. Well, then these folks come in under this scenario, they get their 20-foot or 25-foot removal to the water line, but then can they put in grass if they've got all that trees and that brush there? Because their neighbors on all the other sides have grass actually, you know, between their house and the water line. They might be able to at least throw a football or play badminton there. But if I got to leave everything as natural, you know, do I have the options of doing anything else on the rest of my property in front of my house? And it doesn't fit what the other neighbors are doing. As much as a protectionist I would be, I would hope that at least you could enjoy some of that property by saying no vegetation removal. You know, you might have 200 trees there. Well, just by the natural place of the development, another place might have only 10 trees there. So I guess I'm a little curious as to what we would allow in that no vegetation removal.
I can chime in a little bit on that, Commissioner Persky. This is Angie Berg.
and I don't know if Nick has the current slide, maybe it was in your packet about what's currently allowed, but in the current ordinance, you're still only allowed a view corridor, and anything outside of that view corridor, you can't touch anyway. That's already the requirement today. And so this is an effort for ease of administration. I think we've learned a lot in the last few years. This is by far the hardest part of the ordinance to enforce because the evidence is gone. The trees are typically gone. So the idea with this is that it's clear for the landowner and it's clear for staff when we're looking at enforcing the conditions. I'll just say one more comment. If you look on page 18 of your review packet, that's the diagram of what's currently allowed. So that's your 50 foot or half of the lot width, and then you get to take out 25%. But there's still the rest of that area is still no veg removal, except for your buckthorn and prickly ash, etc.
Yeah. And Angie, I realize that there are very few non-developed lots, out there as well. So we're looking at a limited number of new lots actually that are there. So.
Right, so the next item on here on the agenda, score your shore site assessment. So we talked about this a little bit last time. It's kind of a quick review. This is a tool that was developed by the DNR as a kind of a quick way to assess the vegetation quality on a riparian lot and site conditions. So there's 3 different areas: the upland area, the shoreline area, the aquatic area. From a county perspective, we would only be looking at the shoreline and upland areas, because the DNR would have jurisdiction in the aquatic area. And this tool utilizes a scoring system based on the cover and the quality of the vegetation that's present in each of these zones. So we're trying to get away where we can kind of really measure and assess the habitat and the vegetation quality on these properties. So to visualize here, we identify the 3 different habitat zones. Some lots are a little bit more challenging than others to identify them, but it can be pretty clear on a lot of them. So then each zone is scored based on the cover and the quality of the tree and lower story cover. With the upland and then the shoreline zones. And then you would kind of come up with a threshold that we would look for to meet kind of minimum requirements to really maintain and improve water quality on the water bodies. So if we were to use a tool like this, it could be completed during a pre-application site visit that's already part of the shoreland permit process. Property owner participation in the process and the site assessment would be the most useful, because then we could get that education aspect as well. So in here, if we were to use this, I put in a couple numbers, and we're going to run through a few examples here with some pictures of some properties that I've been to in the last year. We can kind of determine what we would want to look for, and if there's kind of a threshold or a number that we would want to look at. In the upland zone, I kind of looked at like the second lowest number, which would be between 1 and 24% cover, and the shoreline zone, 17 is a little bit higher, between 25 and 49%. But we can look at that. Let's take a look at a few examples here. So here's one. This is the backyard between the structure and the water body. This is a pretty blatant example, but it kind of serves the purpose here. So if we're going to look at upland tree cover, there's not really a lot of trees present. There are 2 trees down here. One of them blew over actually in a windstorm a couple of days before I was there, but there's really only like 1 or 2 trees. That would still yield a 1 to 24% cover, which would be 9 points in this scoring metric. The next thing we would look at would be shrub cover. It's really not any shrub cover at all in the property. It's pretty much all long grass, so there'd be no shrubs present here, which would be 0. And looking at the ground cover, it's all mowed, bare, or impervious surface, which would be a 0. Now here's what it looks like by the lake. So this is the shoreline zone. We're going to look at the tree and shrub cover. The argument could probably be made that that little shrub and tree off to the top there could be included. So even if we did include that, that would be a 1 to 24%, which would be 5. And obviously, it's just mowed grass all the way to the water's edge, which is not ideal by any means. So that would be a 0. So here, we would look at requiring some kind of mitigation before additional alterations could be made. So if you wanted to bring in a couple loads of fill to create a spot by the lake for something, or build it up to make a retaining wall or something like that, we would want to look at, okay, well, what are we doing here? Another thing could be like riprap placement. We see that there's some rock there. Maybe they want to add more rock for some reason. Is there an erosion issue? And if there is or isn't, what kind of vegetation do we have to the water's edge? Here's another example. So we've got property here. We've got some tree cover, so definitely some established trees. Canopies of the tree cover probably covers 25 to 50% of the lot, potentially more than 50. The canopy cover is what we would look at here on these trees. So how much of that does it cover on the property? So in the upland area here, there's definitely trees, probably 25 to 50, maybe even greater than 50%. So it's either a 13 or an 18 is kind of a point value there. The next thing we look at would be the shrub cover. So it's not really a lot by the trees, but there are a few closer up towards the house that can't really be seen in this picture. So even if there's a few, it'd be 1 to 24% cover. It'd be 5 points. Now we look at the ground cover, pretty much all mowed grass. So then we would put that in at 0 points for that. That's the upland. Now we look at the shoreland areas. Tree and shrub cover. There probably were some shrubs there before it was mowed down. Now there's really nothing, so it's all mowed. Nothing really present there. And the ground cover, it's all mowed and bare. So we would want to look, the argument could be made that the upland is fine, which would be fine, but the shoreline area, we'd probably want to look at some kind of buffer, allowing some kind of vegetation to grow through there and not mow to the edge. We'll look at one more here. Another one. There's some tree cover, a few trees between the structure and the lake. Here again, it's a little tough to tell what the canopy's not shown in the picture, but this is probably around that 25% range. Shrub cover, there's not as much. Ground cover is pretty much all mowed. Look at the shoreline. There's a birch tree there, kind of by the shore. Provides a little bit, so there'd be some kind of credit there. Ground cover, we've got mowed lawn grass to a very steep edge at the water's edge with some rock that's tumbling down. That's what happens when it's installed incorrectly. We get the idea. So like on this one, there's some tree cover, there's some shrub cover, and there's ground cover. It's not all mowed. So this one would score better. So that's how that would be used. So it's the option here would be to require an assessment to be completed as part of the process to obtain a shoreline alteration permit. And if it didn't meet the minimum criteria, it would need to, the applicant would need to seek a variance to still allow the project to happen without meeting those criteria, or they would need to incorporate something as part of their plan to bring them up to the minimum standard. This kind of prevents properties from continuing to do alterations and continuing to degrade the property, and it's something that we don't really consider that much currently. So this would be a way to do that. I guess with that, any thoughts and discussion on this aspect?
This is Jason again. I personally like this. It's like a Lisa score, and it's a data point. I don't know that we can ever go all in on what these scores are and not allow something. But back to that point about there being trade-offs. If you have a lot that you inherited that scores very lowly or scores very low, and you want to try to do another project, how can you incorporate elements that are going to improve that property and still allow you the flexibility to do what you want to do? I like this. I think it creates a lot of good discussions when the county's working with the property owners, and really helps us accomplish preserving, the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan.
This is Sean. I'd have to say I agree. I really like this plan too. I think it has a whole lot more flexibility, and it's not quite the trap that the lesser score ends up being at times, because there are so many different factors involved, and they kind of work together to reinforce each other. So I think it's a much stronger type of a scale.
This is Greg Berg. So Nick, if you ran something like this and they were required mitigation, and I know this can be worked out, there'd have to be some guidelines, and then would they come up with a plan as a property owner or a contractor on their own?
Yeah. So, Greg, you and I, we both have used various like plant lists for buffers and things before. Those would be great resources that we could help provide if they didn't have something right off the bat or didn't know how to maybe design to mitigate some of that. So yeah, it could be a combination of like, it's on them to do it, but we have a few resources if they wanted to incorporate something that we had as recommendations that wouldn't necessarily be us designing the project necessarily, but it'd be providing resources and handouts as maybe as part of the, we've referenced kind of a fact sheet of some sort a couple times now. If we had that as part of like the shoreland summary or something where people could look to as a resource, it's easy ways to incorporate and improve their scores for upland or shoreline areas.
I don't know exactly what I mean, but could this be considered a soft standard?
If we didn't have like a specific threshold to it, I guess it could be considered like a soft standard. I think if we were to determine a number, or especially using like a numbered metric like this, it might be more of a hard standard, but I think the way I see it, it would be more of a hard standard to me that has flexibility in terms of how you get there.
Sure, Lensmeyer, this is Angie Berg. Just to add on to Nick's comment a little bit too, one of the other ideas could be, it could be a soft standard, if you will, for and only required for major shoreline alteration permits. So it wouldn't be something that staff can't operate with a soft standard. We need to have a number, or there's too much discretion. But the Planning Commission and the County Board could have us run the number, if you will, kind of like we do on the Lisa score, but not make a judgment on whether or not something should or shouldn't happen based on that. Just a thought.
Okay, I'll go with that. The flexibility is there, it's just not from you.
Well, the other two thoughts I had were, one, I was just re-looking at the numbers. Those aren't very high numbers. I mean, it would not be hard for somebody. You didn't pick ones that should be tough to fix, right? So I mean, if you'd had a higher number, I'd be a bit more concerned about it, but I think that's a threshold. Another way that it could be approached is if they don't meet those numbers, you know, doing some type of almost like a growth measure. You scored this, you need to increase to at least this. And that to me would be a bit softerly. I mean, it wouldn't be prohibitive, but that might be a little bit more work. But I do want to reinforce those numbers are not particularly high.
Yeah, I kind of kept those a little bit lower. We can always reevaluate and go higher if we feel that these are lower. It's better to start on the lower end and work our way up if we need to.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think in some ways that helps people with success too, right? If they can meet it, they can say, oh, I mean, this is what I need to do. And with your education. So to me, it was a good starting point. We may, don't know where exactly we might end up, but as you were going through what those numbers are, it just wouldn't take very much.
This is Greg. Lee, one way to soften this might be too is that, you know, they could look at the option of planting vegetation, but then they could also maybe have an option of, okay, I'm going to try to put in a rain garden that treats, you know, 5% of the impervious area on the lot or something like that too. And that might do just as much good as planting, you know, 10 trees in a certain area.
Yeah, so options.
That gets to the flexibility then. All right.
I like it. I think it's a step in the right direction. And who knows, maybe even some people will go above and beyond what we even recommend for the mitigation. They'll kind of get an idea of, you know, what moving it even further in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. We always talk about how, you know, people might be resistant at first, but there are definitely people who, once they're aware of this and see this, will maybe take it a step further. That does happen. And I don't think those stories are told as much as the, you know, the inverse, but that does happen with the education piece. So I think that's important to highlight that.
Well, I've got 3 20-somethings in my family that give me lots of advice, and relative to their idea of natural beauty, it's more along the lines of this as opposed to, you know, some of my fellow geezers that, damn it, if it isn't green grass right down to the water's edge, you're wasting your time. So I have seen this evolve. I mean, when, you know, back in the day, you'd had a hell of a time selling this, but we're starting to see some examples, you know, real world examples as opposed to something from the pages of Better Homes and Gardens that really do look pretty attractive. So I think that this concept deserves a chance.
Lee, this is Jason. The competitive nature of myself, like, makes me look at my own property and want to score higher. So I think there may be others that will look at it the same way and say, hey, I score too low. I want to see what I can do. My neighbor's lot scores higher than I do.
Okay.
Maybe we can turn that concept of greener grass on the other side of the fence into a different verbiage.
I send over the alpacas and train them to poop there.
I'll get some from Jeff.
There you go.
So it sounds like there's a lot of favorable opinions on this. So I think move this forward, and we can always adjust it as we move ahead. So the last kind of item on here is a couple different concepts. violations, work allow permits, and then I list the fee schedule for the different shoreline alterations, and we can talk about that a little bit, but it's not necessarily part of the ordinance amendments. So this one here, this is an option we could add to the ordinance. So in terms of violations, another form of, we talked a little bit about carrots and sticks. This would be more on the stick side, would be like a penalty or an opportunity to dissuade work without permits, would be requiring a compliance inspection of the septic system. Even so, if there's a project that was completed that didn't have a permit, the property owner at that point would be able to mitigate the project or get an after the fact permit for it. This is only in the situation where they would like remedy the situation and restore it back to what it was. There would be no septic system compliance inspection of this for that shoreline project if it was returned to what it was. This would be kind of a way to dissuade that from happening. They would still need the compliance inspection on the septic.
I'm for that.
And for that would only be, how frequently would they have to get a compliance inspection?
It would be the same. It'd be the same time frame as the other ones if they hadn't had one in the last 3 years, a compliance inspection, or if a system was older than 5 years old.
Okay.
So we keep that continuity on the time frames. It's just a matter of like saying, okay, you did this. Even if you're not going to pull a permit for it, you still did this and it's a violation. So we're still going to require the compliance inspection. So in here, I just put a list of kind of the permit fees. So we've got the after the fact permit fees listed for both the minors and the majors. This would be more of in terms of the discussion of like the fee schedule and stuff, but not necessarily part of the ordinance amendments. But I think it's important that we keep these, we consider this as well because it is directly related to what we're talking about, especially if we're talking about reduced fees for like a sand blanket or something like that. That's all part of the conversation. And then there has been some discussion, like at the last meeting, about addressing fees for after the fact. So I don't know if we have a lot of discussion on this here necessarily, but I think it's something just to kind of keep in mind and think about as we look at amendments to what we're requiring permits for. And then here, some of the options to consider, maybe I mentioned the sand blankets we talked about last time a little bit, reducing that permit fee for sand blankets to only $100 or $200 or something like that. That could also be done in conjunction with minor shoreline alteration applications. Currently, it's $400 regardless of what's being done under a minor permit. So somebody might do sand blanket, retaining wall, and some excavation all under a minor permit. It's going to be the same cost as if they were just doing a small retaining wall. So, one opportunity here might be to do kind of a tiered approach. If they're doing one aspect of that's, of a permitted project, it's only $200. But if they're doing more than one, then it goes up to the $400. It's kind of that scaling concept that we had talked about a little bit, being more flexible in that arrangement. And it came up earlier when we talked about the shoreline contractors and work without permits, increasing the dollar amount for after the fact fees. I believe somebody had mentioned about a % cost of the project as an after the fact fee. That could be difficult for a lot of after the fact fees if we don't know how much material was moved or what, we don't, because we're not necessarily there before the violation occurs. So looking at a concrete dollar amount might be more useful in those situations, but that kind of discussion can continue on as we talk about fees down the road. So with that, that covers everything on the agenda. Were there any other thoughts or comments?
just to comment on that after the fact fee. I think from a staff basis, sometimes an after the fact fee might very well just take care of it, and one visit takes, care of the situation. But some of the things we run into, takes numerous visits by numerous people and is more costly. I'm just wondering if there's some way to weigh that in as far as staff's time, as far as the cost of the after the fact. Just an idea.
Commissioner Persky, this is Angie Berg. I'll weigh in a bit on that. So former Commissioner Haas actually brought up the idea of the tiered approach, and I think it's very effective. It's on page 22 of your review packet that Nick sent out, and it's basically where you have an elevated fee if there's continuing to be if we continue to have to send notice to the property owner. So it gives incentive to the property owner to work with staff right away and not ignore the letters or the phone calls. And I think that whatever that number is inserted as, I really would advocate for keeping that tiered approach in place.
I agree.
Joe, it does go back, as Angie stated, and where the discussion started was, well, do the fees actually cover the cost of staff time for these various functions? And they certainly don't. But the bottom line was Larry's idea was essentially a scheme where you buy your way out of jail, so to speak. That if you have these issues come up and you've gone ahead. Well, first of all, the challenging thing is to try to determine whether somebody made an honest mistake or a dishonest mistake. But the buy your way out of jail concept came up when Oz was here, and it has some merit. These fees don't begin to cover the investment the county's got to make in regulating this. Good eye, Joe.
Sidley, I don't want to be accused of thinking like Larry, okay? God bless him.
I don't know, Joe. That's a compliment if you're thinking like Larry. Just saying.
Yeah, I miss Larry.
One crisis at a time. Relative to the fees, I don't have any real wisdom on this, whether they're high, whether they're low, or whatever. But I would, I'm hoping that we would see some sort of situation where, and I don't know what level this would be at, but where people can buy their way out, because you're not always dealing with SOB. You're often dealing with someone who just doesn't know. And so, like I say, that's a tough call. I've had enough.
Well, I don't want to take over Nick's show. This is Angie Berg, but if there's no other final questions or comments on the shoreline, I would just like to thank everybody for their time. I know it was probably an extra hour, but I do appreciate you powering through this because we are planning on meeting again on December 21st. We'll be talking about solar farms and RVs, which are two completely different topics, but both very controversial. So they do have that in common. And then at that meeting, we'll also be talking about how to engage our stakeholders. And we have some ideas on that. So we will discuss that more at our next meeting.
Oh, I can hardly wait.
Right.
Stay safe, everybody. Take care of yourselves.
And that's an early meeting, right?
Thank you all. Hey, Nick, thank you.
Bye now.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.